Hello and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us and what time zone you're in today. You are joining the Center for Strategic and International Studies conversation about what's happening in northern Ethiopia. And in particular, we're going to be talking about the access constraints that humanitarian organizations are facing there. My name is Kimberly Flowers. I am the former director and founder of the Humanitarian Agenda program at CSIS. I was also the director of the Global Food Security program there. In a previous life, I worked for USAID, including living and working for USAID in Ethiopia for 3 years. I'd like to start this conversation by first thanking the CSIS team for pulling together such an important conversation and the great work they've done to get us here. I'd also like to thank the USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs. CSIS has a partnership with them, and without that, these conversations like this may not be possible. So first, let's frame the conversation. Right now, all the political attention, resources, and leadership tend, at least in the public eye, to be focused on the war in Ukraine. But there is what I would call a forgotten war of what's happening in Ethiopia, and it's of such a greater magnitude. The World Health Organization Director General Dr. Tedros has said that nowhere on earth where the health of millions of people is more under threat than in Ethiopia. And the numbers are really staggering. They're sort of mind-boggling. It's hard to get information out, but from what we think and what we know, there are over 5 million people in the area of Tigray or northern Ethiopia who are in need of humanitarian support, 2 million people displaced, and over 500,000 people have been killed. There was a humanitarian truce earlier this year, but even during that time, humanitarian access was quite constrained. And now attacks have started again and resumed. And we want to talk today about a couple of things. One is, what does it look like right now from what we know? What does access constraints look like? How can humanitarian organizations get the aid that's needed to the civilians that are there, that are caught in the middle of this? We're also going to be talking about the impact that this conflict has both in the rest of Ethiopia, which is facing the worst drought they've seen in 4 decades, as well as the region. There's a lot of impacts that this has in terms of the region. And the 2 people that we have with us today, who I'm about to introduce, have vast regional experience. And so you will see them touch on what they know about Ethiopia, but also the implications of elsewhere. I want to invite our audience. You can submit questions for our panelists. A couple ways you can do that. You can look on the CSIS webpage or the event page, and there's a button there. Or just look below, and in the YouTube event description, there's a link, and you can click on that as well. And we hope to be able to take some of your questions. So let me tell you who else is on this call and in this conversation. We have Michael Dunford, who's the regional director for the UN World Food Program. Michael has been with the World Food Program for 2 decades. He's coming to us from Nairobi, which is where he lives. He's been there for 2.5 years. He's covered a lot in the region. I mean, as the regional director, he covers 10 different countries. And as most of us know, I can't imagine our audience doesn't know the role of the World Food Program and how vital it is in getting food and nutrition assistance to the most vulnerable. Michael has had experience in Tanzania and Uganda and Bangladesh. He was the World Food Program Emergency Coordinator for the Rohingya crisis back in 2017. And he actually started his career as a UN volunteer in Ukraine. We also have with us Abdullahi Halaki. He is the senior advocate for East Africa from Refugees International. He has had a decade of experience as an African policy expert working on conflict and human rights and refugee work and aid reform. He's worked for, I could spend a long time saying all the places he's worked and what he's done, but I'll just name a few. He's also worked for international humanitarian organizations such as the International Rescue Committee, International Crisis Group, Amnesty International. And he's also worked for government organizations like the European Union, African Union, USAID, World Bank. His expertise is again in the region, but both of these experts also know a lot about Ethiopia. And he's worked on issues particularly around internally displaced persons and aid reform. So I think to get us started, I think I want to start with you, Michael. I laid out some of the basic statistics, but help us just get a grasp on what is it like right now? What's happening? And what are some of the greatest humanitarian needs? And in particular, talking about access constraints. So, Michael, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Let me turn on my microphone, that will help. Kimberly, thanks very much, and delighted to be with you, Abdullahi, and all the colleagues online. I think you've given a very good introduction. The war, the conflict in northern Ethiopia started almost 2 years ago, and in many ways we're back to square one. Despite all of the efforts of humanitarian actors, including the World Food Programme, as of today, there is virtually no access and hence no humanitarian support going into Tigray. But in fact, this is a conflict that is much greater than Tigray alone. This is impacting over 13 million people across northern Ethiopia. Tigray is the one that's grabbing a lot of the headlines, and rightfully so. But it's important to recognize that this is impacting over 13 million across the north, including in Amhara and Afar. And add to that, there's another emergency going on, and I suspect we'll come to it later in the conversation. Almost 20 million people are impacted by either the conflicts or the drought in Ethiopia today. So huge pressure on the country, and it's a reflection of what's happening actually across the region. We've never seen the food security situation as bad in Eastern Africa and the Horn as we are today. This time last year, 51 million people in IPC 3, 4, and 5. So acutely food insecure, acutely hungry. Today, that number's up to 82 million. So it's increased by over 31 million in less than 12 months. And my great fear is that we're not at the top of those numbers. We're not at the bottom of the situation across the region. So delighted to be with you, looking forward to the conversation. But it's very important to frame what's happening in northern Ethiopia in the context of the region and, in fact, globally. We've never seen a global food crisis to the extent that we are today.
Well, that's just hard to hear, right? You feel like we've made so much progress. I worked in food security for so long now. There's so many gains, and it's just been, it's just heartbreaking to see really where we are. Abdullahi, let's turn to you, and same question really to kind of get us started is, you know, as you look at what's happening right now, what is top of mind to you? What are you seeing? I know you just got back from the region yourself. You're in DC today, but you know, what do you see in terms of what's happening with Ethiopia and in particular around humanitarian access?
Yeah, I think what Michael said is really sobering, right? I mean, like, that's where we are. For me, really, the most important thing is, yes, the Tigray region grabs the headline, and it should rightly so. But I think it's not just the Tigray question. It's also the question of the Ethiopia. I think over the last few years, maybe probably even decades, Ethiopia has never been this fraught. You know, it's not just Tigray, it's not just Afar, it's not just, in Oromia region. It's almost, if you look at all the major regions of Ethiopia, the situation is fairly grim. And so it's not just a question of Tigray, it's not just a question of Ethiopia. I think even more importantly, it's the question of the Horn. I mean, this is the worst drought in 40 years. I mean, and this is, you know, we've had 4 failed or below average rainfall, and we are heading into the 5th. And some are projecting that we are heading, even the, you know, March, April, May, MAM rains, that is usually the long rains, will be below average by some estimate, by 62%. So it just suddenly then becomes something that we have not dealt with, as actors in this space. So 6 failed rainy season. I mean, it's the Horn of Africa where we always say it's unprecedented. We are breaking record numbers in almost everything. I mean, like the numbers that Michael shared, that is just scratching the surface. If you just go below that, the MAM numbers, the GAM numbers, malnourished kids, I think the numbers are very, very staggering. You look at even places like Kenya, which is, middle low middle income countries, there are certain regions where I visited and the GAM numbers are around 40%. We're talking about Kenya. We're talking about, 700,000 people in Al-Shabaab controlled areas, and these numbers should be taken with a fair degree of salt because we do not have good, accurate data about it that humanitarian groups cannot access. We are talking about close to, and again, livestock census numbers are not accurate. We are talking about, 10 million livestock gone. That is close to 4 billion, very average number. If you give it 400 each, it's higher than that. 4 billion intergenerational wealth that has been wiped out. Not just, the way you look at livestock, at least in the Horn of Africa, is for lactating mothers and children, this is the most readily available source of food. So I think you're looking at not just a humanitarian problem, it is a massive humanitarian problem. Even if you suspend for a second access question, not just in Tigray, but even places that are controlled by Al-Shabaab, even if you control for a second the war in Ukraine, where it's not only taking resources and attention, political and diplomatic, you're staring at a very, very difficult situation where the systems that we've set in place that we've been using are not only inadequate, they might be a problem to this to this particular crisis. So we are not talking about a crisis. We are talking about crises, and the tools that we've designed over the last few years that we've used that have failed is very difficult. I'll finish by just saying that again, in terms of this crisis, 2011 was a very good period. We can go back, but it's not useful for the purpose of this conversation. 2010, 2011. We were pretty much in the same place. 2016, 17, 18, the response was fairly better. Why is the response now good? And when I talk about response, it's not just funding, which is very important, but I'm talking about the distance between early warnings that have been coming for some time and the early response. I'll leave it at that, and we'll dig into some of these things as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Well, let's talk specifically about access, right? So, as I said at the beginning, there was this humanitarian truce, right? There was this ceasefire, and those that haven't been operational on the ground, I think, might assume when that happens that suddenly the doors open and it's unfettered access, right? And we know that's not the case for a variety of reasons. But let's talk about, during that pause, was aid able to get in? How much aid was able to get in? And what happened, or what does it look like when suddenly fighting resumes, and that everything shuts again? Michael, was WFP able to get in during those ceasefire? What did that look like for you?
In fact, that was an extraordinarily positive period for WFP and all humanitarian actors. It wasn't perfect. In fact, it was a long way from perfect. But in comparison to what was the situation before, or certainly what the situation is now, we were able, over the course of those 5 months, from the 1st of April through until the conflict resumed, we were able to get upwards of 240,000 metric tons in. We were able to move in excess of about 8,000 trucks in over that period. That was moving trucks in, that was bringing trucks out. We moved 2.5 million liters of fuel that was for our operations as WFP, but also available for the broader humanitarian. So for that window of 5 months during the humanitarian truce, a truce that we had been calling for an extended period of time, during that period, yes, significant progress was made, but it was far from perfect. The telecommunications system was still down. The ability to bring in cash to the extent required was still limited. Today, much of that has evaporated. We're not moving any trucks in presently. We have no fuel that has arrived since the 24th. Currently, the only distributions ongoing is food that was already in place. Fuel is being rationed. Our staff have not been able to come out, or new staff go in, since the 24th of August. So many staff now have been in far in excess of what was planned. Some need to come out for medical reasons. Others simply need a rest, and we want to be able to rotate. The flights that we were using in and out on UNHAS they're suspended currently. So all of these elements are prohibiting the ability of the international community to respond to the immediate needs. And Abdullahi had already touched on it. We've got huge levels of food insecurity. 89% of the population, 5.2 million people we estimate, have limited food capacity. Over 40% of them are acutely food insecure. So there's a real need for the offensive to end, the fighting to stop, and a humanitarian truce and a corridor be re-established so that the World Food Programme and others can upscale to the extent required.
Abdullahi, do you agree? Is that what you see too from your perspective? And then maybe to add to that, you both have mentioned already, the telecommunication issues, the fuel issues. So maybe Abdullahi, talk about the access constraints during the truce versus now that you've been looking at, but also some of those compounding factors that makes it even more difficult, whether there's a truce or not.
Yeah, I think the 5-month period, everybody who, particularly those who are at the sharp end of the operation delivery of humanitarian aid, it was good. It could be better. And then again, that 5-month period ended, on the 24th of August when the new rounds of conflict came about. But my sense really is, absence of unfettered, guaranteed humanitarian access. And this doesn't just mean, trucks going in and coming out, but also it means fuel. If there isn't enough fuel, which was already rationed by the Ethiopian federal government, then it becomes really difficult. Food aid can reach Mekelle, but there are other places outside Mekelle that desperately need this food aid. And if it's not allowed, it becomes incredibly difficult. You have food that is ever so closer to people, but it's not delivered to people who are in desperate need of it. Not because the food is not available, not because the expertise are lacking, but because of, a slow burning tactic from the Ethiopian authorities, federal authorities, to deny these people food. It's been 2 years now, right? This November will be 2 years. So that makes it very difficult. I just want to add something just a little bit to that and make another final point. When humanitarian groups cannot access a region, yes, the first order that is really problematic is people will not get the sort of support that they will get. But it also, we are losing a tremendous amount of information that can be collected, that can be used for the purposes of planning, right? Some of the data that is coming out of Ethiopia, they are proxy data, particularly in the Tigray region. And so when you do not have adequate data that you can use for planning purposes and all other stuff, then it becomes very difficult. Even if, the humanitarian groups are given all the money that they demand and it's hardly there, your planning would fall short of what you need. And then because it's not just the access, it's the banking that is not there. They've been offline for the last 2 years. It's telecom. You cannot send money using mobile money transfer. So you are compounding all these problems, and then it really becomes a very, very difficult position. And for folks who are, in the delivery of humanitarian aid, you feel like you're just a sitting duck waiting for something to happen. So it wasn't perfect. It was already very strained. But I want to finish by saying that I think most operational humanitarian groups have taken a fairly pragmatic approach in how they can negotiate access. All right. But the challenge really is for the Ethiopian federal government. This is a salami tactic, because most of the, humanitarian groups that are delivering humanitarian aid they want, at least if they can save 1 life, 2 lives, it's far more important than looking for a perfect situation. What that does is, progressively, the Ethiopian government makes the constraint very difficult. In the short term, it's easier, it's reasonable, it's almost pragmatic that they are taking less no piece of the Ethiopian government. But in the end, like we've seen now after this 5-month period, they I've shut it down now. And it becomes then, what was the use of not pushing the envelope? And we are left now, again, scratching our, your heads, not knowing what will happen next. Thank you.
So, Michael, you mentioned something just before, kind of, how WFP is trying to help push, for negotiations and peace, and, just asserting how important it is. So what is the role? Like, how, there's a lot of very important talk about how UN organizations and even, humanitarian actors, are impartial and neutral. And there's that sort of tension between the inherent political nature of everything related to this, but also the difference between, a humanitarian organization staying neutral and reaching all in need. So I guess my question is, what's the role of UN agencies and operational NGOs in terms of diplomatic and peace negotiations? Like, was there any role that was played in order to have this last ceasefire, and what role can they play to perhaps get another ceasefire or a humanitarian corridor?
I think you rightfully say that our primary role is to be there to support the population from a humanitarian perspective. And that's a role that we do and execute impartially, neutrally. But of course, we're engaging with all actors to try and facilitate the access that is required. I think there are agencies, there are entities, there's the diplomatic community that is better placed to really lead on the peace negotiations and to try and advocate for the humanitarian truces. But what we are able to do is highlight what are the risks to the population if that access is not available. What are the implications and what are the needs? In many occasions, humanitarians are the voice of the populations to highlight what needs to be done to meet their basic requirements. And again, it's very important that this is not just a Tigray issue. This is a northern Ethiopia. And at the end of the day, they're all Ethiopians. Whether they come from Amhara, Tigray, or Afar, this is the responsibility, first and foremost, of the government, but then all of the state governments as well, to meet the requirements of their populations with the support of the international humanitarian stakeholders.
I mean, it seems to me that it's also the responsibility of, when I look at the United States or the international community, the United States is by far the largest donor. They've given over $2 billion in aid from USAID and State Department to the Horn of Africa just in this year, and yet seem to be silent. And I'm sure there are things happening behind the scenes. I understand the political sensitivities and complexities, but it just feels like it's, again, like they've been silent and that there hasn't been enough attention, or certainly not public attention. But I diverge. Abdullahi,
I'm not sure on that. First and foremost,
okay,
the US government has been extraordinarily generous. They carry the lion's share of the funding for the World Food Program. And as you said, they've given very generously. Without the US government at this point, not only Ethiopia, but the rest of the Horn would be in a dire, catastrophic state. So we're hugely appreciative. They have been active, particularly at the front end of the conflict. We know they're investing heavily in trying to come up with a diplomatic solution. We appreciate those efforts. But I think it can't be left to one single stakeholder. There's a role for the African Union. There's a role for the Middle East. There's a role for any stakeholder or actor or government who can influence the parties. First and foremost, to end the conflict. Then to ensure that there is the humanitarian access and availability that is necessary to meet the needs of the population.
Those are good points. Thank you. And all of that is also true. Abdullahi, what do you think about that in terms of just the international or the diplomatic pressure and role in terms of speaking out on this, or in terms of peace negotiations? What do you feel in terms of the international attention, and whether it's the United States or other major players, are they doing what they can behind the scenes or publicly to help with this conflict?
No, thank you so much. I think we can delineate a couple of things. One is the principled humanitarian delivery versus the political process. I think in the Tigrayan case and also the region, the adjacent region, I think it will be very, very difficult to decouple this for primary reasons. Number one, at least for the Ethiopian government for the last 2 years, this is a tactical war. Food is a tactical war. So I think it's not whether humanitarian groups or, diplomatic political actors want it. It is prima facie there. Number two, for the TP and DLF, I think sometimes we forget that they have also a domestic constituency. A domestic constituency that has held the line for the last almost 2 years. This constituency, the only thing is for fettered humanitarian access because of conflict and as well as, natural factors, the banking and, telecom and others to come online, at least for them, to breathe before anything else. So once you remove that, I don't think the current leadership will even survive because that is how bad the situation is. So the idea that they might, as a principal actor in this conflict, would get that off the table will be very, very difficult. So therefore, from the outset, you are looking at an incredibly contested situation. In terms of if, again, international actors, particularly the US and the EU, are doing enough, the first few months of the conflict, senior leadership, they've come out, made, fairly, reasonable demands, the slew of threats, including some of the sanctions. I think after that, it was, there's nothing that we can speak of. Let's be very honest at this stage. Things that are going behind the scenes, we are not privy to it, so we can't comment about it. But for the rest, including the UN, the last time, the senior leadership, the SG came and spoke about, de facto blockade. That was fairly strong, even by the UN standards, but was very important. The USG, I don't think, despite all other senior leadership, visiting the region, hasn't visited the region. And so I think there is something lacking there. And I think for the Ethiopian government, they feel insulated for now, at least. Otherwise, I don't think the 24th August conflict would have, come the way it came. It's not just that now. Even Eritrea feels emboldened. I think over the last 48 hours, some of the reporting that we are getting is that, there is an amazing of, troops by the Eritrea. And I think from where I sit, there needs to be a fairly robust response, and that can just be behind the scenes. That just can't be, visit by the special envoy. That I don't think is what will move the needle. And I think also at this stage, it's been 2 years, we've got to disabuse ourselves the notion that, the AU process, even if it's just in name, led by Obasanjo, will yield much. Let's just be frank, because it will be in the interest of so many people in whose name we are doing what we are doing. It will be almost dead on arrival. Then I think if that process is not working, all right, if that is our base, then we need to figure out what other processes that can be engaged, because this process can be allowed to go on. Let's be really honest with ourselves. It's not just the conflict. It's not just the COVID. It's not just the locust. It's not just the climate change. We are dealing with multiple streams. I don't want this to turn into an Olympic of all the miseries in the Horn. But I think that is where we are. The systems are creaking under the inadequacies of not just funding. Is it fit for purpose? There's so many balls up in the air. Which one do you work on? And, I don't envy, people like Mycon, what they are trying to do. With limited funding, with limited political and diplomatic attention that comes to the region. And, the reality is, in the next few weeks, I think the Somalia food assessment is being carried. I think that process is on. I think for Somalia, we are practically in famine situation, and that will be announced. Maybe, which is again incredibly frustrating to say, when those photos start hitting the headlines of newspapers and whatever, is that when the response will be more robust.
Well, both of you have touched on, the implications this conflict has had, in terms of the region. So let's go there a little bit deeper. You brought up Somalia. We know Eritrea is engaged. Michael, turning back to you, I mean, you've worked in the region for a long time, and your perspective and your responsibilities is the region. So how do you see what's happening in northern Ethiopia affecting other areas? Is it a matter of attention and aid going elsewhere? What is your greatest concern with that?
My greatest concern at the moment is that, we're rapidly approaching a point where simply we will not meet the needs of all of the populations who require assistance, either from WFP or others. Abdullahi's touched on the situation in Somalia. This is the one that perhaps is attracting, after an extended period where it was not gaining the attention required, is now suddenly doing so. But that's because 6.7 million people are acutely food insecure. And we are doing everything to prevent a famine. And even that may not be sufficient. WFP has scaled up from 1.5 million in April, again with funding from the US government primarily. We're now reaching over 4.5 million people. So huge efforts, but a hugely complicated environment in which to reach the population because of Al-Shabaab and because of the remoteness of much of the population. In fact, I was on a call yesterday, currently in Baidoa, which is the epicenter of the crisis. 59% of children under 5 are malnourished. And if it wasn't for the support of the humanitarian actors, be it the NGOs, the UN and others, we would see a very dramatic deterioration and an increase in mortality. So we are doing everything we can presently. And it's that combination of the ongoing conflicts married with the impacts of climate change, which we have never seen at such levels. We're still recovering from the economic shock of COVID. And now we're also seeing this dramatic increase in prices, some of it created by the dislocation caused by COVID, others by the conflict in Ukraine and elsewhere. So you put all of those factors together, that's why the number of people who are hungry every night has grown to such a level. And that's why WFP and others are struggling to generate the levels of funding. I appreciate very much efforts by CSIS such as this one, where we are given that platform to make the case to decision makers who really need to look to see what more can be done for the Horn today, what's the moral imperative to address those needs. Interestingly, in Somalia, it produces virtually no discernible contribution to greenhouse gases, but it is on the front line of what climate change is actually doing. And it's populations such as this, highly vulnerable to start with, who really cannot absorb any greater pressure on their households.
Abdullahi, what more do you want to add to that, particularly talking about the regional impacts?
No, the regional impact is, it's the Horn, right? We keep on saying unprecedented. It is really an inflection point. We really are there. 6 failed or below the average rain. This region is practically governed by rain. And if there is not enough rain, if October, November, December, we know it's below average. It's now being predicted. March, April, May, which is the second rain cycle, we are talking about by a factor of 62%, it will be below average rain. So we are walking with our eyes open into probably one of the most unprecedented crises in the region. And it's not one country, it's a set of countries. It's not one issue, it's multiple issues. And, just the final point Michael spoke about, about climate change, right? There is the Green Climate Fund. Somalia hasn't received $1. It's not received. It's the front line of this. It hasn't received $1 towards this. And even accessing the Green Climate Fund, which is, runs into billions of dollars. I think it's, the last time I checked, something like almost 40 billion. Somalia has not accessed $1. Somalia is probably one of the most countries that is extremely vulnerable to this particular problem. So for me, really, when you are speaking about, malnutrition numbers around 59%. So let's just step back. These are numbers that we have. Let's also just project if we go on the same status quo, we are entering really difficult territories. For children, let's not forget, the cognitive issues that comes with not getting adequate nutrition moving forward. So we are not just looking at here and now, which is very difficult, and we all know and we all see. And we are also projecting based on what the data that we have. So I think a lot of the time the debates around these issues in many spaces, both political and humanitarian, tends to, sometimes focus on a particular country, set of countries. I think we will all, the analytic value of stepping away, not just from a region or country, but into the whole region. We haven't spoken about the Sudans, which are in their own state, right? So you're suddenly being confronted by multiple crises, and, some of the intervention, just taking one as funding, is always inadequate. I think over the last 12 years, the Somalia humanitarian plan has not been fully funded. In 2011, some of these are structural problems that were identified in 2011 and were part of that problem. Are we, even within the policy spaces, are the discussions about humanitarian, counterterrorism carve-outs being hard? Because we know what it did. Thankfully, unlike in 2011, at least Al-Shabaab is not preventing people leaving the areas that they control. But we are talking about 0.7 million people. And that is also just estimate because you can't access we don't have good sensors. So we are talking about all these problems. And if we are not going to act now, A, the conflict need to stop, B, unfettered humanitarian access. And even more importantly, I know there's just so many things to deal with. Accountability of denial of access of food, GBV problems that we've seen that have been documented, by tenacious journalists, human rights, organizations. We have the evidence. We cannot say never again just as a slogan. We have to act, and act we should now. We talk about, within these spaces again, the window. There is no house there's no house, it's not about window. Window is very small. The house is gone. We are all standing naked. And if there is no action now, and it's not just now, into 2023, we are staring into a really, really bigger problems that it's not like we weren't warned. It's not that we didn't know this. At least, food assessment, people are doing climate assessment. These people have done such a good work between 2011 and now. Some of the data that is out there, they're fairly close to the bone in terms of being accurate. But what is done with that data? Here, within the political spaces, global capitals, in humanitarian organization, people like Michael at the sharp end, they are trying to do with what they have. But the reality is, we're all slowly being prepped, walking into this problem with our eyes open, and there is no solution in sight. We will come because it's being driven by the news cycle. When, photos from Reuters, CNN, and BBC start reaching out, everybody, there will be righteous indignation. More aid will be freed up. People will start visiting this region and, all the shebang that goes with it. But the thing is, we know very well, like, for instance, if I have 10 cows and I lose 5 and you help me, I have something to lean on. when all my 10 cows are gone, it will require you a lot of money that is not available to prop me up.
Yeah.
We're talking about 10 million cows gone. It's like that is billions of US dollars gone. That coming back will take long, if drought permitting. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
I want to use the rest of our time to pull some questions that we're getting in from the audience. And one of the questions talks about, well, really, I'm going to add my own to this a little bit, but in the sense of you two have painted a pretty dire picture, right? And you're right, like these unprecedented numbers, climate change, COVID, Ukraine war, conflicts, there's a very limited amount of resources, right? Like there's only a certain amount of funding, even if we have the data, even if we know how, there's only much funding. But the question is, from someone is, do you consider moving resources elsewhere where there's greater needs, and as long as access continues to be denied? So essentially, if access is denied, can you just say, fine, then we can't even focus on that area, we'll just go over here? Does that make sense for the question?
When there are 13 million people across northern Ethiopia who are impacted, you can't ignore it.
Yeah.
You can't ignore it. We do need to prioritize, obviously. And I think Abdullahi raises some very good points. At some point, we're going to have to revisit how the humanitarian development architecture is addressed to ensure that there's sufficient funding. It's not going to happen today, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but this is something that is going to have to be revisited because of the increased demands that we're all experiencing. And yes, conflict is one of the key drivers, and it's certainly the case in northern Ethiopia, but let's not lose track of what impact climate is having and how climate is also potentially going to create insecurity and future conflicts. At the same time that we're having the worst drought in 40 years, the fourth historical level of flooding is taking place in South Sudan. It's displaced over 1 million people who are now coming into conflict with the people who are hosting them. So we need to rethink how we are meeting the needs caused by climate and what changes need to happen. What is a drought? What is a flood? It's a water crisis. They need to be addressed differently, but ultimately it is driving so much of the food insecurity, undernutrition, and other concerns that exist today. So I think water, for example, is going to be one area that we're going to need to revisit to ensure that we have a joined up effort to redistribute where possible. So I don't think you can ignore simply because you don't have the access. We need to continue to invest the time, effort, and resources to ensuring that we ultimately have the access required. But it is true that we are competing with so many crises, not only in the region, but across the globe. We're not talking yet about Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and many others. So it is, as I said at the outset, a global food crisis. We've never seen such humanitarian needs, and it's going to deteriorate before it starts to improve.
Abdullahi, is there anything you want to add to that? I have a question too from audience member that I think is really specific to you, but anything you want to add to that?
I just want to make one small point. There's a lot to be said about this, but I think amidst all this, let's not forget the refugees and the IDPs in all this. All right.
That's what the question is about. So you're just going right into it. Thank you for that. Go ahead. Sorry, didn't mean.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was in Turkana, which is in northwest of Kenya, already from South Sudan. I think by the end of this year, we would get something like 30,000 fleeing various issues, conflict, food insecurity, nutrition insecurity into Kenya. The camp already is overstretched. The facilities and support mechanisms are already overstretched. Inside Ethiopia, we are seeing now UNHCR not being able to reach some of these people who are already displaced. Eritrean refugees who are in Tigrayan region who have been moved elsewhere. So we've got to remember that in Somalia, some of the refugees have, some people from Somalia who are refugees have now started coming into Kenya. And so there is also that. I just didn't want them to be ignored. Thank you.
If I may, I think it's an excellent point. There are over 4.7 million refugees in the region, over 12 million IDPs. The big problem that HCR, WFP are facing is they're not going home. These refugees have been there often for in excess of 20 years. If you go to Dadaab, 30 years that people have been relying on humanitarian assistance. WFP in many of these locations now have reduced the rations. We're providing less than what is deemed to be the minimum requirement for a healthy diet. So this is also very much linked to the conflicts, obviously, but something that we need to continue to work at. So again, we cannot forget these populations. We cannot forget these crises. In fact, if anything, we need to reinvest efforts to try and resolve them, including in northern Ethiopia, in the same way South Sudan, Somalia, and elsewhere.
The question from an audience member is related, but one that you didn't quite touch on. But I'm gonna ask Abdullahi to start. The question is: there are many Eritreans refugees in Tigray and other parts of Ethiopia, and how is the lack of aid and access affecting those refugees specifically?
They are probably one of the subset of people who are very much affected than this, because Eritrea now is an active actor in this space. They ran for various reasons to Ethiopia, which for years has provided them with comfort. But now, because of the conflict, now they have moved elsewhere. So and then we had reports a few weeks ago where some of them moved into Addis, and they have now been ferried back against their will into the Amara region, and that makes them incredibly vulnerable. The last thing you want as a refugee is for you now to feel, even for your safety and security, away from where you ran, to be threatened. So they already are vulnerable. Now you are adding another layer of vulnerability, and the UNHCR is in a very tight position, trying to get them, to move to certain places that they don't deem safe. So I think, again, it's a big problem. Every layer, if you go down, you feel, that within the food chain, you feel people who are more vulnerable. So I think you feel like the center cannot hold, and, so many people who are already vulnerable are wrapped around with different layer of vulnerability. And I think that the Eritrean refugees are probably one of those who are really feeling these. Not all of them, but a subset of them that are in a very difficult position. And UNHCR is trying to do what they could, but I think it's not enough.
Michael, do you want to add to that, or I can move on to another question?
Look, I was in northern Amhara about 2-3 weeks ago. I met Eritreans who had been displaced, first from Eritrea to Tigray, where they'd been for an extended period of time, now having to be relocated. And in many ways, they're starting over again. Yeah. And, the plight of the Eritreans is desperate, as is the plight of the population across that region. Anyone impacted by the conflict as it continues is feeling the brunt of it. So, yeah. It is a bleak situation. I'm sorry to the audience, because I don't have a lot of good news at the moment. Hopefully, we can get a humanitarian truce, and hopefully we will be able to recommence. But that is an absolute key criteria, and anyone online who can help influence that, we encourage them to do so.
Well, we do have a question online from USAID, someone who works on the Northern Ethiopian response team. And they state USAID is tracking very closely the access constraints that aid agencies are facing and the impact that that's having on the provision of life-saving aid in the most vulnerable. So what do you think donors like the United States can do to bring greater attention to the situation? And what advice do you have in terms of how to ensure that their messaging is most impactful? I should say, I went off earlier about, the United States need to pay attention, but of course we know, I've worked at USAID, there's a huge amount of sincere, passionate people working and tracking this. But what advice do you have of how to get that high up? How to get that, what is the messaging that they can do to really make a difference?
Who would you like to kick off?
Michael, go first. I mean,
all right, you guys pick. Which
it's not that I'm dodging. It's just that, in all fairness, there are certain things that I can say that, you cannot say because of, so many other things, but also you are at the sharp end of this and you guys do the delivery. So I want to be respectful of that, but go on then.
Thanks a lot for that. Look, I think we all need to lean in from whichever position or whichever seat we're currently holding to try and ensure that first and foremost, the conflict in northern Ethiopia, the needs across the Horn are front and center of decision makers. There are a variety of channels that can be leveraged. Again, CSIS, thank you very much for your efforts today to contribute to those efforts. Again, it won't just be the US government. It needs to be a collective of the international community. I think the AU has an enormous role to play, as do states in the Middle East and Europe. It needs to be that collective joined up effort. But ultimately, it comes down to the protagonists in the conflict. It needs to come from all parties to recognize that this is not going to be solved militarily. It needs to be resolved through a negotiated settlement. And from there, we as an international humanitarian community can step up and support to meet the population's needs.
Abdullahi, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the USAID and US government, I think they could do more, but they are doing far more than others. Then it becomes very difficult to even criticize them. I spoke to UNICEF when I was in the region. They said over 70% of their funding comes from USAID, the USG. All right, in various forms. I don't want to get into the weeds of it. All right. I think, when the leadership of USAID traveled to the region, brought, attention, at the highest level. I mean, Sam was there, Sarah was there. I think that in itself is very, very important, right? But I think my sense is, I'm not in some of those meetings, was they go, they show, and then they are generous in terms of their support. Other donors will step in. That has not happened. And I think it's very important, at least from the Europeans, to need to step up to the plate. All right. That is very, very important because it cannot just be the USG. It can't just be, every time there is congressional hearing on these. I mean, at some point, somebody will stop and ask, are we the only one? Why are we the only one doing this? Now, that is very important. But I think the overall funding architecture needs to be, it's not something new, but I think flexible multi-year funding makes a difference. All right. If we keep on relying on these, annual funding cycles, like we said, we've been talking about how this is complex, complicated, multi-layered and whatever. Multi-year flexible funding is the bare minimum. It's not the gold standard that we would use, in the past. It is the bare minimum where, if I have 100 million that I can move around because I know I'll get another 100 million within, I have that discretion. That if you don't have that, you'll sit tight to figure out who are the most absolute vulnerable that I have to, program for. So I think that is also, it's not again just multi-year and flexible, but at the time when it comes, it cannot come when people are on their deathbed and you're trying to feed them organic food. It won't help. So it needs to come, slightly early, and that is where flexible funding, I think, will help. I think in terms of the attention, it would be a remiss to not mention that, yes, there are no trees where money grows. We all know that. But I think if you look at the level of response, political, diplomatic, and finance to the Ukraine crisis, it's never the same to the Horn of Africa. Even per dollar per person, it's not anywhere near. Then that just shows that there is a fair degree of lack of political will to respond to this until it becomes desperate. This, I want to make it very clear, is by no means saying that the Ukraine humanitarian funding should be taken away. That is far from it. Both of them can be funded, not simultaneously at the same level, but can be funded, because the funding level that we have right now, I don't think for the Horn will not solve the sort of problems that we are dealing with. I think that is, again, I really would want to make this very clear, because most of these countries, or all of these countries, have got social safety mechanism in place with the Ministry of Labor, Ministry of this, and Ministry of this. Because ultimately, yes, people like FP, HCR, and the rest there's only so much that they can do. This again falls squarely on these countries. If a country like Kenya, that is lower middle income country, still has to rely, upwards of 1 million people in need of humanitarian aid. The new president was flagging off food aid. Then we have a serious problem, which again takes me to the next point. It is, again, we need to begin figuring out how to transition from consistently being on the treadmill of humanitarian urgent need. Resiliency, development, these things also, we need to begin thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, and thank you to both of you. As we wrap up, this has been, a heartbreaking but a rich conversation. We covered a lot of ground. I mean, from the access constraints to the regional implications to the challenges of, the lack of political attention and will. We only have 2 minutes left, but I just want to turn back to each of you very briefly to see if you have any other final comments or any other final message for our audience before we step away. Michael, any other final comments from you?
No, again, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thanks to CSIS. We need first and foremost the conflicts to end, whether it's in northern Ethiopia or anywhere else across the region. They are creating so much of the hunger that exists today. The situation, of course, is exacerbated by what's happening climatically. And you read the news, and it can be certainly in the Horn, but equally in Florida, in Pakistan. This is real, it's happening. We need to find out ways to address it. We need, as we touched on earlier, identify ways to streamline the accessibility of the climate funding for humanitarian responses. Otherwise, there are people who are going to go hungry. There are people who are going to die as a result. But ultimately, it's going to require the concerted effort of all stakeholders from the highest level to put the pressure on the parties to the conflict that it must end, and it must end soon. As I said at the beginning, what's happening in northern Ethiopia is not going to be resolved militarily. It needs to be done through a negotiated process. Both sides, all sides, in fact, are going to have to find ways to compromise so that the population is able to ultimately return to a way of life where they can meet their own requirements. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. Abdullahi, final words in 1 minute.
Thank you so much. Apologies again for, it being very bleak, but at least would rather have these rather than, good nothings. 2 or 3 points. Number one, the system is not fit for purpose. That is the humanitarian funding system. We are not dealing with one problem, we're dealing with multiple problems. So it is even more imperative to be able to fix this. Number two, climate change is not tomorrow. Climate change and its impact is today. If funding and interventions are not aligned with that, then we will be having this conversation next year, the year after, and on all the other times. Finally, let's think about the children. In 2011, 260,000 people died in Somalia. Half of those were children. We are getting closer to that, if not surpassing that. Let's think about not just food insecurity, but also the malnutrition insecurity.
Thank you both very much. And thank you very much to our audience members and for your questions. We hope that you learned something today. We hope that you also will continue to think about this topic and try to take action and press your policymakers and others to pay attention. Have a wonderful evening or day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.